Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual book talk by Marc C. Johnson, author of Tuesday Night Massacre, 4 Senate Elections and the Radicalization of the Republican Party, available now from University of Oklahoma Press. Tonight's event is presented by the Culver Public Policy Center with co-sponsorship from the Iowa History Center at Simpson College. My name is Seth Anderson, and I serve as director of the Culver Center, a nonpartisan politics and policy center founded in 2010 to honor the legacy of former U.S. Senator John C. Culver of Iowa. The Culver Center offers educational programming and political engagement opportunities to Simpson College students, faculty, staff, and the broader community. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary during this pandemic year with a series of virtual programs on a broad range of topics. Although we are very much looking forward to resuming traditional in-person programs and events in the fall. Through the Culver Fellows Program, Simpson College has offered scholarships and co-curricular experiential learning opportunities to more than 100 students over the past decade. Alumni of the Culver Fellows Program have recently formed their own association to support the center's mission and work to inspire students to pursue civic engagement and public service with the type of integrity and moral courage that Senator Culver personified during his lifetime. The Culver Center is delighted to welcome Marc C. Johnson to discuss his new study of 4 key U.S. Senate elections in 1980 that reshaped the American political terrain in ways that continue to be felt to this day. Johnson's writing on politics and history has appeared in numerous regional and national publications, including the New York Times, the California Journal of Politics and Policy, Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and the Blue Review, the policy journal of Boise State University. His blog and podcast on history and politics is entitled Many Things Considered. A journalism graduate of South Dakota State University, where he was named an outstanding alumnus, Johnson has chaired both the Idaho Humanities Council and the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and has frequently served as a National Endowment for the Humanities site visitor. He has taught courses on politics and history at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Boise State University and the University of Arizona. Johnson has worked as a broadcast journalist, a top aide to Idaho's longest serving governor, Cecil D. Andrus, and as a communication and crisis management consultant. Johnson's re-examination of the defeats of Senator Culver and 3 other liberal lions of the Senate in 1980 sheds new light on the dynamics that led to the first Republican-controlled Senate since 1954. Senator Culver, Senator Frank Church of Idaho, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota represented a group of liberal institutionalists who cultivated productive compromises on big issues with their Republican colleagues in what some have called the last great Senate. These 4 senators were targeted early on in their re-election campaigns by a remarkably well-funded and closely coordinated effort led by the upstart National Conservative Political Action Committee, which successfully turned these races into single-issue contests through relentless, ideologically driven attacks on the records and characters of the incumbent Democrats. As Johnson shows in Tuesday Night Massacre, the playbook developed by NCPAC in 1980 is still very much in use today, with unlimited outside spending, attack ads, and the nationalization of U.S. Senate races becoming the norm rather than the exception. One need only look to the January 2021 special elections for 2 Senate seats in Georgia to see these dynamics reach their apex, with nearly $1 billion spent, primarily by outside groups, to influence 2 elections that held control of the U.S. Senate in the balance. Marc Johnson's study captures Senator Culver's fighting spirit and his legendary skills as a storyteller and teller of blunt truths as well. Chapter 5 of Tuesday Night Massacre, which focuses on the 1980 Senate election in Iowa, opens with these words that Senator Culver told political scientist Richard Fenno on the campaign trail that year. "I don't mean to sound noble in a silly-assed way, but I'd a hell of a lot rather fight for my beliefs and lose than whore around. I'm not so naive as to believe that most politicians feel this way, or even a majority. But shouldn't that be the standard? I'm a lot more concerned with what my grandchildren and great-grandchildren will think of what I did. I want them to be able to say, there was a son of a bitch who stood for something and fought for something in good times and bad times." We're also honored to welcome to the virtual audience tonight several staffers, friends, and family of Senator Culver's and Senator By's who were deeply involved with their careers in public service and their re-election campaigns. Many of you will recognize the campaign posters over my shoulder from 1980. We look forward to taking your questions and comments and to engaging in a robust discussion of the lessons to be learned from the Tuesday Night Massacre of November 1980. Please submit your questions for Mark Johnson through the Q&A box in Zoom as they occur to you. I will pose your questions to Mark after his presentation. And please note that tonight's program is being recorded, but only Mark and I will appear on screen. It is now my great pleasure to introduce author and political historian Marc C. Johnson to discuss his new book, Tuesday Night Massacre.
Thank you, Seth. Great to be with you. It's really a pleasure to be at an event sponsored by the Culver Center and the Iowa History Center. I've long admired the work of both organizations, and it's really a great opportunity for me to be with you tonight and talk about this new book and the career and 1980 campaign of Iowa's John Culver. I just want to, for a moment, establish my own thin Iowa bona fides. Seth mentioned that I graduated from South Dakota State University. This was 1975, so I'll date myself. And of course, needed a job right out of journalism school. I took a job, my first job out of college, at at a radio station in Old Wine, Iowa. A little bit north of Waterloo. I'm sure many of you know where Old Wine is. My main job there was to prepare the noontime market report, the daily livestock and grain market report from South St. Paul and Sioux City and all over the upper Midwest. And I came into work one day and I told the news director that I had noticed that the wife of the former governor of Georgia was going to be in town that day, and maybe I should take a few minutes and go see if I could talk to her about her husband's presidential aspirations. I'd like to be able to say this many years later that as a 22-year-old journalist, fresh out of college, that I saw the importance of the Iowa caucuses to Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign. I can't say that with any degree of honesty, but it is a lead-in, I think, in a way to 1980, because it takes some time to see the events of our historical past in the context that we can view them with 40 years of retrospect. So I want to talk a little bit about that 1980 election tonight and why I believe it continues to resonate so much in our politics today. Shameless promotion, Seth was nice to mention the book, which has been out for a little less than a month, and hope you'll consider purchasing at your local bookstore, independent bookstore. 1980 really was a hinge point in American political history. Several things came together in 1980 that I think were hard to recognize at the time as having real lasting significance. Obviously, there was the Reagan landslide. Ronald Reagan defeats incumbent President Jimmy Carter in a huge presidential landslide, one of the greatest presidential election victories in American history. 1980 also saw, I think, not really for the first time, but in a very sophisticated way, the impact of political research, political surveying. The research was becoming much more sophisticated. These were the days of landline telephones. You didn't have to worry about trying to navigate the internet or talk to somebody on their cell phone. It was before people got really resistant to giving pollsters good information. So sophisticated research was really coming into its own. This is the era of direct mail, solicitation by direct mail of contributions. And the impact of the direct mail campaign in the Culver Grassley race, I think, was dramatic. Not only did it raise money for some of these new right groups, but it allowed them to put a very targeted message right into the mailboxes of hundreds of thousands of people across the country. You really had, for the first time, the coordinated use of these independent expenditure campaigns, thanks to a 1976 Supreme Court ruling the Buckley case, which essentially said that independent expenditure groups could raise and spend unlimited amounts of money as long as they maintained independence from a political, from a campaign, from a candidate's campaign. And Nickpack, and I'll talk a little bit more about Nickpack in a moment, really monetized these independent expenditure campaigns, and in a way weaponized them for the new right. 1980 also marked, I think, the real gelling of the evangelical Christian vote as really falling in line behind Republican candidates in general, and the challengers to these Senate Democrats in particular. And you have obviously the coalition that we now think of as the new right, the Moral Majority, Phyllis Schlafly's group, the Eagle Forum, and of course, Nickpack. And Republicans capture the Senate, as Seth mentioned, for the first time since the Eisenhower administration. 12 Democratic Senate seats flip in 1980. One of those, of course, belongs to John Culver. I want to talk a little bit in a moment about Elizabeth Drew's book about Senator Culver, which was actually came out a couple of years before the 1978 campaign, it came out in 1978 before the 1980 campaign. And I think she did a pretty good job of capturing Culver's style, his personality, and his belief about politics in the Senate. I'll just reduce his political career maybe to 5 bullet points. He was definitely a legislator. He went to Washington, D.C., first in the House and then in the Senate to work on things, to pass legislation. By all accounts, he was a workhorse, somebody who really dug in to issues deeply and worked hard on them, became a master of the details of legislation. Although very junior as a member in the Senate in the late 70s, he quickly became a very respected bipartisan leader on armed services issues, national security issues. He could be demanding and difficult, according to some people who were on his staff, demanding both of himself and those who worked for him, but a real laser-like intellect at the same time. And above all, I would say, and I would underscore this, a politician who was definitely his own man. All of those attributes both serve to define John Culver, and I think in a way, ironic way, made him vulnerable to attacks from Nickpack and others in 1980. So Nickpack, this is Terry Dolan. He became the executive director of Nickpack, one of 3 young new right activists who formed the organization in 1975. The other 2 were Charlie Black, who is still around Washington, D.C., as a very prominent Republican lobbyist and consultant. And the third original founder of Nickpack was a guy named Roger Stone. Yes, that Roger Stone. He's been in the news a little bit lately. They formed Nickpack in 1975 with the intent purpose of trying to redirect the Republican Party in a more ideological direction. They wanted a pure conservative party, an ideologically conservative party, wanted to get rid of the moderates. And by 1980, Nickpack had become, I think of them as sort of the tip of the spear of these new right groups, which included the Moral Majority, the American Conservative Union, Phyllis Schlafly's group, and a handful of others. They were really calling the shots, the quarterback, if you will, on the very coordinated effort that rolled out against many Democrats in 1980, and particularly against the 4 that I highlight in my book. And Dolan was remarkably candid in talking about what he was trying to do with this group. He said in one quote, groups like ours could be very dangerous. We could lie through our teeth and nobody would be held accountable for it. He said about the campaign that he waged against Frank Church in Idaho. Church was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at this time. He said people will be voting against Frank Church in 1980 and they won't even remember why. He had a very limited role of view of the role of government. He basically wanted a minimalist government, and he believed that the GOP leading up to The Reagan campaign in 1980 had been too timid in taking on Democrats and liberals in particular. So he wanted to take over the Republican Party, take over its messaging, and I argue he basically succeeded in doing that. If there is a godfather of Nickpack, it was Jesse Helms, the Republican, very conservative Republican senator from North Carolina. Helms encouraged the formation of Nickpack, lent his credibility to these young activists, and gave them, in essence, a playbook, the politics of resentment, I call it, something that Helms had perfected in his own Senate campaigns in North Carolina. It's been said that politics is the art of understanding who hates who, and he certainly had that attitude. Helms certainly had the attitude about resentment and grievance sort of being at the heart of his approach to political messaging. The other person that Helms brought to the table, another person that he brought to the table, was Richard Viguerie, sometimes referred to as the funding father of the new right. Viguerie was a direct mail wizard. He formed and created actually an enormous enterprise built around direct mail fundraising and message delivery. And he figured out how to monetize and wage political warfare, if you will, around fear and anger as a message. And he was very good at exploiting the so-called wedge issues, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, and he too, like Terry Dolan, wanted to purge moderates from the party. Viguerie, a few years ago, did an interview with Terry Gross on Fresh Air on NPR, and he flat out said that people are motivated by anger and much more by anger than they are by positive emotions. And the final contribution that Jesse Helms made to Nickpack was Arthur Finkelstein. By all accounts, a brilliant political pollster and strategist. Finkelstein did all of the polling work for Nickpack. He had been Jesse Helms's pollster from the very beginning of Helms's presidential or senatorial campaign career. And he was skilled at identifying and motivating what he called low information voters, voters who were maybe only occasionally involved in the political process, maybe were not regular readers of newspapers or consumers of news, but who could be moved and motivated by messages based around emotion. His surveys, Finkelstein's surveys, convinced Chuck Grassley to run for the Senate and to take on John Culver in particular. And days before the GOP primary in 1980, Nickpack actually sent out a mailer touting Chuck Grassley in the Republican primary that year in Iowa. Finkelstein said he believed that elections were becoming more about ideology and less about parties in 1980. One admirer said that he could look at a set of polling numbers and figure out how emotion read into them. One of the things that I think I bring new to this story is a deeper dive into the work that Dick Fenno did in this period, and Seth mentioned Professor Fenno also. He had remarkable access to Senator Culver in 1980, also to Dan Quayle, who ran for the Senate against Birch Bayh in Indiana that year. He traveled with Culver quite extensively, had really unfettered access, near as I can tell, to the campaign, and spent hours, listening into the strategy sessions, observing Culver on the stump and in campaign settings, and came away convinced that, as we alluded to earlier, Senator Culver was a person, as Fenno said, who fought for his views and was willing to live or die by them. Professor Fenno's papers are at the University of Rochester, and he used a lot of the information for his own book, Senators on the Campaign Trail, but he also kept a lot of information out of the book, and they were gracious to give me access to those materials, and I quote from them quite extensively in the book. a real insider's view of what was happening on the campaign. So Culver versus Grassley. Chuck Grassley, congressman at that point, running for the United States Senate, very much in the sort of ideological view of these new right groups, their kind of candidate, similar to Steve Sims in Idaho, who was taking on Frank Church, similar to Dan Quayle in Indiana taking on Birch Bayh. Although Grassley would go to some considerable pains to say that the influence of the new right in his election in 1980 was overstated, it's remarkable the overlap between the attacks that were being made on Culver by Nickpack and others and the narrative line that the Grassley campaign maintained. Essentially, the attacks on Culver were on his character and on his patriotism. It was said that he was weak on national defense. Grassley, at one point in a debate, attacked Senator Culver's Harvard education. They were debating the wisdom of tax cuts and economic policy. And Grassley basically said, John, you're getting your ideas from Harvard. That's a bad place to be getting them. Sort of disparaging, the intellectualism of Senator Culver and his Ivy League education, a theme that I think you see a lot in American politics to this day. One of the ads that Nickpack ran against Culver in 1980 was so-called Globetrotter ad. It was a bouncing basketball and the old Sweet Georgia Brown theme that the Harlem Globetrotters always used, playing in the background, criticizing Culver for junkets that he was taking as a member of the Armed Services Committee to study international affairs on a firsthand basis, and equating that somehow with some kind of a freebie trip that was costing the taxpayers money and had very little benefit. He was charged with being a baby killer, anti-Christian, a threat to families, and sympathetic to homosexuals. One particularly odious attack was mounted during the summer of 1980 by Nickpack against Senator Culver. This is a picture of Culver and his friend from college days, Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, when Culver was in the House and Kennedy was already in the Senate. They remained close friends throughout their life. Particularly odious attack made on Culver at the time of the Chappaquiddick incident, where some of you will remember Ted Kennedy was driving an automobile that careened off a narrow bridge in Massachusetts on an island off the Cape Cod, and the young woman in the car with Kennedy drowned. He escaped the accident. Culver went to see Kennedy at this time to provide, as an old friend would want to do, some solace in this accident. And the smear was that he had somehow been involved in to mastermind a cover-up of what had actually happened in the accident. The smear was so bad and so obvious that a number of newspapers editorialized against it. Nickpack eventually disavowed the attack, but the damage had been done clearly. And immediately, Senator Grassley, then Congressman Grassley, was able to pivot and say, well, it wasn't me that made that attack, and he could disavow it. And he was actually compelled to say that it was Culver who was engaged in the mudslinging politics. This is one of the real powerful elements that go along with these independent expenditure campaigns. What they have real power in the sense that the independent attack campaign can smear an opponent and then the candidate who benefits from the smear can disavow it, but still have the attack redound to their benefit. As Dolan said again about the campaign in Idaho against Frank Church, early on in that campaign, he said Steve Sims won't have to say a negative thing about Frank Church. We'll do all the nasty stuff. So Grassley had the opportunity to disavow these attacks, say it really wasn't helping him, that the new right was kind of a figment of the Democratic and Culver mindset. That's not the case. It was very much a real thing. It was profoundly cynical, but it was also quite effective because you can distance yourself but still enjoy the benefits of the attack. And of course, as I said, there definitely was a new right in 1980, and indeed it was quite effective. I would not make the charge, and I do not make the charge in the book, that it was all Nickpack's doing that Chuck Grassley won the Senate race. 1980 was a very difficult time to be a Democrat for many reasons. But because of the early start of Nickpack, starting in 1979 with direct mail and other attack ads directed at Culver, they set the groundwork for what happened during the campaign. They kind of framed the issues, if you will, and created the narrative that Grassley was, or that Culver was too liberal for Iowa, that he was out of touch with his state, and that became sort of the defining narrative throughout the course of the campaign. So Nickpack directly contributed to the defeat, as Seth said earlier, of 4 Senate liberals on November 4th, 1980, hence Tuesday Night Massacre. Culver lost to Grassley. Birch Bayh loses in Indiana to Dan Quayle. George McGovern loses in South Dakota to Congressman Jim Abner. And Frank Church loses in Idaho to Congressman Steve Sims. So no coincidence that all of the challengers were conservative members of the House of Representatives, each of whom, I argue in the book, had been groomed by these new right groups, including Nickpack, to be in a position to challenge these incumbent Democrats. And I draw the distinction between the 4 incumbents who lost and the people who defeated them as being between traditionalists, Senate traditionalists, and what I would call institutional radicals. Culver, Bayh, McGovern, Church all went to Congress and to the Senate in order to do things. They were legislators. They wanted to pass legislation to address problems. The folks that replaced them, for the most part, had a different agenda. They generally were opposed to things. They did not particularly have a strong legislative agenda or an issue mix. They tended to be anti-things, anti-big government, anti-taxes, anti sort of the New Deal legacy of the Democratic Party in the 1970s and 80s. Nickpack clearly overstated its role in 1980. It's entirely possible that all of these guys would have lost re-election in 1980, given the difficulty of being a Democrat that year, an unpopular president, the Iranian hostage crisis going on, inflation being a concern, a general disquieting in the country about the direction that the country was headed. But the tactics that they employed, the direct mail attacks, the televised and radio and newspaper attacks, the idea that they were monetizing these Senate races on a national basis, where people from Missouri and Texas and Oklahoma were contributing to the defeat of a Senate candidate in Iowa. All of those things are a lasting consequence of the 1980 campaign. One of the reasons that Culver really stands out in this group to me is that he really understood, I think, what was happening both to American politics and what was going to happen as a consequence of this kind of ideological conservatism taking over one of the major political parties. He knew that it was going to be deadly for bipartisan cooperation in the Senate. A single individual vote, he said, could be plucked out of a long record and made the centerpiece of an attack ad. So, and he realized that a tactic was already being employed where particular votes were being staged so that they would be able to be weaponized against a candidate in the future. He understood, Culver did, that legislating is hard work. It's not all slogans and inflexible positions. But the kind of campaign, frankly, that was waged against him, where he was pounded away on very emotional, kind of simplistic issues, giving away the Panama Canal, killing babies. The message made voters angry and resentful about politics. And he saw what was coming for the Senate and for American politics. He said just a few days before the election that he still thought he had a chance to pull out the election. And he said, I want to prove to some of those other senators that you can fight back and stand up and win. If we can't, God help us, everyone will be trimming their sails. John Culver thought of the Senate as a very human institution. Here he is, of course, with Senator from Colorado, Gary Hart, also a member of the Armed Services Committee in this period. A human institution that had to operate on the basis of interpersonal relationships, compromise, a willingness to seek consensus, work across the bipartisan aisle. And he saw that this increasing demonization and nationalization of each and every Senate race would really be deadly to that in the Senate. I was just rereading a couple of days ago a passage out of Elizabeth Drew's book that I mentioned earlier, Senator. Let me just read one short paragraph. Culver is lamenting the fact that these single issue type campaigns are being waged all over the country with increasing frequency. And he said, you can form a necklace of all these single issue constituencies devoid of common purpose or value, and an unprincipled politician can cynically exploit them. That's a direct quote. And then he goes on to answer Elizabeth Drew's question, if he thinks it's a temporary phenomenon. There is one theory, he says, that sees the current malaise as temporary. These were words that were spoken in 1978. But what worries me is that there is a profoundly disturbing sign that this mood of disillusionment and cynicism is altering the practical realities of political representation and distorting the values of public service. The danger is that we're getting to the point where the lack of trust threatens the very basis of our system of government, which is, after all, based on the consent of the governed. Traditionally, we have an acceptance of the notion that we are a republic, where an elected official is given a franchise for a certain period of time, 2, 4, 6 years, to represent as best he can the interests of his constituents, as well as to contribute the best of his judgment. So he's saying, basically, I think, that we were in danger with these kinds of campaigns that really came into their own in 1980, of sort of distorting the idea of representative democracy, that a campaign could be run against a guy who had a record, who was willing to defend that record, but was hard-pressed to defend it when the attacks were so unfair, so emotional, and so incendiary. So the Senate after 1980, what do we have? You all know what you read and see about the Senate these days. The great battle in American politics is always over who controls the White House, but you could also make the case that it's almost as important, maybe just as important, who controls the Senate. And an important battle is waged now every 2 years since 1980 for control of the Senate. We've had 13 change elections since 1980, 5 in the last 10 years, where the Senate has switched hands. Bipartisanship, by virtue of the recent debate over the COVID and economic recovery program, and even the confirmation of so many of President Biden's cabinet appointees, seems to be virtually dead in the Senate. The Senate results almost always now mirror the election results in individual states. This is a remarkable statistic. In 1980, 25 states had bipartisan Senate delegations, split delegations, 25 states. Today, 5 states have that. So we used to call it, Thomas Mann of the Brookings Institution says, we used to call it a permanent campaign. Now it's an unending war that is created by these very narrow majorities. Republican senators, of course, who have hopes to be a presidential candidate, find themselves in a position now where it's, in order to be a viable potential candidate in the future on the Republican side, they've had to think that they have to vote against virtually every one of President Biden's cabinet nominations. The human institution that Culver celebrated has really lost its humanity. And if you're looking to put a pin in the political timeline of when the evolution from a Senate that worked in the 1970s to pass 60s and 70s to pass bipartisan legislation on a whole range of issues, from the Wilderness Act to the Great Society legislation to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in the 60s to the Panama Canal treaties in the 1970s. If you want to look to what's happened from the Senate in that period to what happens today, you could start, you could find no better place to start than with these elections in 1980. And particularly a good example of that was the election in Iowa in 1980. I'm going to end with my favorite picture of Senator Culver from his college days at Harvard, packing the football. And I hope we have some time left for your questions, and I'd be delighted to try to respond to them. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you so much, Mark. That wonderful and award-winning photo of John Culver scoring a touchdown in the great 13-0 victory, Harvard victory over Yale, that won an award as the best sports, one of the best sports photographs of the year that year, and a large copy of that hangs here at the Culver Center, of course.
Great photo.
So, yes. So on to questions. Yes, we have several excellent questions. Thank you again to everyone for joining our program tonight and submitting your questions. We'll start right out. The first one is, what was the benefit of being Teddy Kennedy's roommate at Harvard? Did that influence Culver's approach to politics, and how?
Well, I think I'd find it hard to believe that it didn't influence his view of politics. They were close personal friends, political allies for sure. I think had a common view, generally speaking, of what it meant to be a member of the United States Congress and eventually the United States Senate. So yeah, how could you not hang around with the Kennedy clan and all of that, steeped in American political history going back to the 1930s and not be influenced by it? I'm sure it had a profound influence. There's some great stories that I'm sure you're familiar with, Seth, and many are, of the times that the two men spent together sailing and, hanging out and enjoying each other's company. So I'm sure it had a profound effect. But at the same time had in some respects, a deleterious effect to Senator Culver's standing at home. It was easy to identify him as, as somebody said, the third senator from Massachusetts, which is really unfair because I think he was deeply steeped in issues that were important to people in Iowa. But the fact that he had a relationship going back to college days with Ted Kennedy was, again, seen as something, some sort of a negative for him, in some people's eyes, at least.
And if I may, Mark, following up on that question, one of my favorite stories that Senator Culver used to tell, of many, was of being at the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport shortly after he helped his friend Teddy Kennedy get elected to the U.S. Senate in 1962. He was a field director in Massachusetts for that campaign, and that he was at a dinner at the Kennedy compound. Everyone else left the room, and there's young John Culver left with Ambassador Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the family, very intimidating figure, right? And so the ambassador says, "John, come here, I want to talk to you." And he says, I really appreciate all of this wonderful help that you've given Teddy, helping him with this campaign, being his dear friend. But you have the skills and talents to do this yourself. You should go home to Iowa and run for office. And so that's another part of that legacy too, is obviously I think Senator Culver was exceptionally fond and loyal to his friend Teddy, but then he kind of got that permission from the ambassador as well to do it his own way.
Yeah, well, to have Joe Kennedy tell you you have a political future, that would be pretty meaningful to anyone, I would think.
Yes, I would think so. Yeah. Next question. Would you say the modern right stands against more things than it stands in support of?
Great question. I would say yes. We've had a debate over the last, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, about just what it does mean to be a conservative in America these days, what it means to be a member of the Republican Party. I would say at one point you could probably say with certainty that most Republicans were free traders. They were strong on national defense. They were deficit hawks. They supported tax cuts. For sure. Some of those things clearly remain the case for most conservatives, but we had record-setting deficits under the last Republican president. We had a wholesale abandonment of the idea of free trade. So I think there's a real debate going on the conservative right in America about what it really means to be a Republican. And you're seeing that kind of play out in real time on a daily basis in the United States Senate and elsewhere right now about, what kind of Republican Party is going to emerge. So I think in the interim, they have kind of reverted to form in a way, in that they are really focused now on cultural issues, cancel culture, and these debates about, big technology censoring conservative voices, which speak to, again, sort of a cultural grievance that I think has always been somewhat prominent in the American conservative mainstream. But that seems to be what the party is really focused on right now. Not so much an economic approach that is different from that being articulated by Democrats or by a Democratic president. You don't see any real I would say real meaningful discussion on the conservative right about national security policy. What is the conservative position on America's role in the world? We saw kind of a wholesale retreat of American leadership in the world during the Trump administration. So I think all of that is in flux. So yeah, I think they fall back on things that they can kind of naturally coalesce to be against.
Another question along those lines, why do you think the Republican right took up this strategy of focusing on a few issues, seizing control of the party, whereas the Democratic left did not do that and still really hasn't consolidated into a couple of core issues or moral issues in the same way that the new right was so successful?
Well, I could give kind of a flippant answer and say that I think generally Democrats and liberals believe in government. Conservatives and Republicans largely don't believe in government. Many conservatives, I think, want a government that does a minimal amount of things, as lacking being intrusive in people's individual lives. Democrats have a more activist view of the role. Liberals have a more activist view of the government and its responsibility to try to address big problems like income inequality and climate change and you name it. The Democrats have an agenda, if you will, and conservatives tend to be much more narrowly focused on the role of government.
Next question. Do you think that had there been a different GOP nominee that was less conservative, i.e. George H.W. Bush or John Anderson, that the new right and the Republican surge more broadly in the 1980 Senate elections would have still occurred?
Well, that's a great question. Political what if? I alluded to the fact that 1980 was a really tough year for Democrats. Jimmy Carter seemed to be quite competitive in the presidential election until the last couple of weeks when things really went badly south for him. Um, and, it was one of those wave elections where lots of people were swept out with a relatively unpopular president, and a sense that the country was willing to make a change. So it could have happened with a different candidate at the head of the ticket. It'd be really kind of hard to say. What I think is easier to say is that, and this is the benefit of being able to look back 40 years and take into account some of the events that occurred leading up to 1980 and in that 1980 campaign, and then measure them through the prism of looking back 40 years, and having the benefit of being able to go to Senator Culver's papers and look at, the polling memos that his campaign staff was working on, and look at the constituent mail he was getting, and all of that gives you a different perspective. So I think that was a really tumultuous time in the country. But again, the hinge point, I think, was the combination of factors that I mentioned at the outset of this talk. The sophisticated research that was being done, the independent expenditure campaigns, all these new right groups really forming very quickly in the late 1970s and getting real traction in 1980. Evangelical Christians had supported Jimmy Carter in 1976, completely flipped and supported Ronald Reagan in 1980. So all of those events had an overpowering impact in the 1980 campaign, and they've all continued to resonate in our politics right up to today.
Next question. Did Culver ever attempt to reclaim his Senate seat from Grassley, or did you know if he entertained the idea of running again? And if not, why?
I don't know of any evidence that he seriously thought about attempting to make a political comeback. I think he kind of left it all on the field, if you will, in 1980. Ran the kind of campaign that he was comfortable running, defending his record, not trimming his sails. And I would say none of these Democrats that I focus on in 1980 did that. They didn't try to run away from their records. Frank Church, who was the floor manager of the Panama Canal treaties in 1978, told his wife shortly before he left to go to the Senate floor to take up that debate that this might cost me my Senate seat. So I think these guys were comfortable. None of them wanted to lose, don't get me wrong. They were upset that they lost and upset in the way that they lost. But at the same time, I think they probably recognized that there was a sea change taking place in American politics. The only one who really ever attempted to make any kind of a comeback was McGovern, who, in sort of maybe a not very attractive way in many people's minds, went on to make a presidential run in 1984, very unsuccessfully, obviously. But Frank Church never attempted to come back, and Senator Biden did not either.
Do you think the idea of attacking the fact that someone is an alumni of an elite institution like Harvard can be parallel to the way that many modern Republicans attack experienced politicians using the term career politician as an insult?
Sure, I think that it's all part and parcel of sort of the demonizing of expertise and disdain for elites, if you will. And you're seeing this play out all across the country right now, again, with attacks on higher education institutions as being, indoctrination factories for young people, being indoctrinated with, leftist and Marxist ideas, these elitist institutions that can't be trusted, anything from the Centers for Disease Control to you name it. Any elite organization where science and expertise sort of is at the forefront is often very, very demonized by many people on the conservative right. So yeah, part and parcel to that is to, demonize an Ivy League education. You're an elitist because you went to an Ivy League institution. The irony is that some of the most self-styled populists on the conservative right have that credential, but they generally tend to try to run away from it. But by the same time, use that argument often to attack their political opponents. So yeah, it's a part and parcel, I think, of the strategy of demonizing expertise, if you will.
The next question is from a former staffer of Senator Culver's who wasn't able to join us with the live presentation this evening, but she asked that I pose this question on her behalf. Former Senator Dick Clark of Iowa noted in his memoir that Roger Jepson, his opponent in the 1978 Iowa Senate election, had benefited from funds from South Africa in that race. Did you find any instances of foreign cash in the 1980 campaigns that you have examined?
Frankly, I did not find evidence of foreign involvement in these campaigns. But to be honest with you, and I did spend quite a bit of time researching the Federal Election Commission reports for Nickpack in particular. The reporting was not very robust, to be honest with you. They got very little scrutiny from the FCC on where the money was coming from. And I think it would have been pretty easy. And I'm not accusing anybody of doing this. I just think it would have been fairly easy to get away with, so to speak, laundering some money from a source that you didn't want to be made public. I didn't find any evidence that that took place, but it would have been fairly easy to do if you would have been inclined to do it.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I touch on the Clark race with Jepson early on in the book because Nickpack was pretty heavily involved in that race. Clearly recruited Jepson, wanted him to run against Dick Clark, put considerable effort behind his campaign. It was almost, and I entitled the chapter of the book Dry Run, because it was kind of a test run of their tactics that they would employ on a broader scale 2 years later.
Mm-hmm. The next question relates to the primarily to the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Buckley v. Vallejo that you discuss extensively in the book.
Right.
It's opening up the floodgates of unregulated, untraceable cash in politics. And this attendee's question is, what do you think it will take to overturn Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United, or I guess and or?
Well, it would take one of two things, either a reversal of Supreme Court decisions and precedent, which is probably a tall order given the current court, or it would require a constitutional amendment to separate the idea of political money from the concept of free speech. So Buckley was the first case in a long list of cases, ultimately leading to Citizens United, that can kind of consistently widen the door, if you will, for more and more unregulated money to come into the political system. And but Buckley was the foundational case. Everything else springs from that. And yeah, reversing it would require, I'm no constitutional law expert, but it would require, I think, either a constitutional amendment or a dramatic reversal of the court's reasoning in a whole series of cases that have rolled out over the last 40 plus years.
So the next question is,
well, I would say one final thing on that,
please.
Seth. You know, we had the reforms in political campaign finance in the Watergate era based on a scandal. You know, political money was very much at the heart of the Watergate scandal. And so something approaching that level of scandal, you know, widespread evidence of foreign money involved in our politics, you know, these dark money groups being used to channel really nefarious sources of money into politics. Something like that might be enough to spawn a backlash against the pretty much Wild West system we have now, which was pretty much anything goes.
And I guess my follow-up to that would be, do you think there's any scandal big enough these days, or any amount of money big enough these days to move voters towards a reform-minded agenda when it comes to campaign finance?
I'm pretty pessimistic about that, to be honest with you. I frankly, I would have thought, given the history of the the conservative right in this country, the idea that a Republican president would benefit from foreign interference by Russia in a political campaign would have been a scandal of Watergate or greater proportions. But it turned out to be not to be, at least for many on the conservative right. So yeah, I'm pretty pessimistic that there's a scandal big enough to cause a significant number of people to rethink their views about that. I hope I'm wrong.
We have
I
time
will
for
just
just a,
say, you know, I've been around politics for 45 years, working in campaigns and for a governor. Anyone in America who does not believe that the vast amounts of money flowing into political campaigns today is not corrupting just hasn't been paying attention. It is a fundamentally corrupting aspect of our politics.
So we have time for just two more questions. The first one is, how did the people who played such dirty politics in the period that you looked at justify themselves? Was it just the hunger for power, or did they actually think that what they were doing was morally justified? It seems clear they knew that what they were doing was not healthy for bipartisanship.
Well, they disdained bipartisanship. They rejected bipartisanship. They very much wanted ideological conservative movement to take over the Republican Party and then eventually take over the country. And so they were motivated by power for sure. They were motivated by a desire to be successful. Terry Dolan, I think in many ways a brilliant political tactician. I think in some respects was motivated by the fact that he developed quite a high public profile. He loved to be on the Today Show. He loved to be quoted in the Washington Post. So you become kind of a political celebrity, if you will, at a very young age. So there's a lot of different motivations involved in politics, but normally power and influence are right at the core of why a lot of people want to be involved in politics.
And the last question tonight, how long did it take you to research and write this book?
Well, I would say maybe 40 years. I was a reporter in Idaho in 1980 when Frank Church and Steve Sims were squared off in an election every bit as bitter and confrontational as the Grassley Culver race in Iowa. So I observed that up close as a reporter, moderated both of the Church and Sims television debates in that election campaign. So I've been thinking about it for a long, long time. It was only within the last 3 years or so, though, that I really started to say, and I think a lot of us, a lot of people, we were grappling with, well, how did we get to this place in our politics? How do we understand where the Republican Party became essentially a fairly radical party? And I got to thinking about the points of light, if you will, that connect the late 1970s and frankly, Donald Trump's rise to the presidency, and started to see some themes that seemed to me to make sense with independent expenditure campaigns and all the other things that served to radicalize the party. So I've been thinking about it for a long time. I actively worked on it for probably 2.5 or 3 years or so. Let me give a shout out to the University of Iowa Library, by the way, which is the repository of both Senator Culver's papers, as you know, Seth, and Senator Clark's papers. Really great collection there, very well archived, and it was a pleasure to do the research there on both of those campaigns.
Wonderful. Well, that takes us exactly to 8 p.m. Central. Thank you again so much, Mark, for sharing your book, your research, and your insights with us. It's really remarkable how the events of 40 plus years ago continue to resonate so loudly with us today. So thanks again, Mark. Thanks to everyone for coming. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much, Seth. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.